My name is Rachel Monroe, and for 7 years, I lived in a shed behind someone else's backyard. Not a tiny house, not a converted cabin, just a plain, weather-beaten storage unit barely big enough to lie down in, and I shared it with my twin boys, Max and Theo. We moved in on a gray morning in early fall, the kind of morning where the air smells like rust and wet leaves, and everything feels heavier than it should. The shed sat behind a stranger's garage, tucked behind a fence, with no insulation, no windows, and no plumbing, just 4 plywood walls and a door that creaked when you opened it. The inside smelled like mildew and motor oil, and I remember standing there with my boys, each holding a backpack full of everything they owned. They were 5 at the time, too young to understand what we had lost, too young to realize we weren't just camping. To them, it felt like an adventure, like we were playing house somewhere secret and special. But I knew better. I knew we were homeless. I knew that every breath I took in that space was a reminder of everything that had come undone. It happened fast. One Thursday evening, my husband came home, dropped his keys on the counter, and said he wasn't coming back. There were no warnings, no arguments leading up to it, just silence, and then the sound of the door closing. Within a week, the rent was overdue, the utilities were shut off, and the landlord was at my door. I had no savings, no family I could call, no degree, no safety net, and no time to think. Just 2 little boys looking up at me, waiting for answers I didn't have. And everywhere I turned, people told me the same thing. Give them up. Let foster care take over. Let the system help. But I couldn't. I wouldn't. I couldn't imagine my sons falling asleep in beds where no one would kiss their foreheads goodnight. So I found that shed. $50 a month to sleep behind someone's garage. I paid in cash and kept quiet, knowing if I made too much noise, we could lose even that. I made curtains from old pillowcases, laid 2 foam pads on the floor, and used milk crates to hold our clothes. There was one outlet, just one, and I used it to heat canned soup in a microwave I bought for $8. I told the boys we were saving up for something special, that this was temporary, that we were on a secret mission. And they believed me, because they trusted me, and that trust was the one thing I couldn't afford to lose. I didn't cry that first night. I sat with my back against the wall, watching them sleep, and promised myself I'd get us out. I didn't know how. I didn't know when. But I knew I wouldn't let go of them. That shed, for all its brokenness, became our lifeboat. It wasn't safe, it wasn't warm, and it wasn't fair. But it was ours. And from that little corner of the world, I began the slow climb back, not for me, for them, for the life I refused to stop believing we still deserved. The mornings always started before the sun came up. I'd set my alarm for 4:30, slip out from between the boys without waking them, and heat water in the little electric kettle I kept near the outlet. That one outlet had to do everything: boil water, heat up soup, charge my phone, and run the desk lamp we used at night. There wasn't a bathroom, so I'd sponge off with warm water in a plastic tub, then braid my hair and put on the same diner uniform I washed in the sink the night before. I kept my makeup in a sandwich bag and applied mascara with shaky hands in the dim light. It was a routine that never got easier, but it became the way I survived. Before I left for the bus, I set things up for Max and Theo. 2 bowls on the overturned crate we used as a table, a cereal box placed next to it, milk tucked into a cooler we refilled with ice every day. I'd leave out their clean clothes on top of folded blankets and write a little reminder list on the whiteboard leaning against the wall. Brush teeth. Eat breakfast. Pack backpack. Wait for Miss Janie. Miss Janie was the woman who owned the house up front. She wasn't warm, but she wasn't unkind either. She agreed to keep an eye out from her kitchen window while the boys waited for the school bus. She never invited us in, never asked questions, but she let us stay, and that counted for something. I worked the morning shift at a diner across town, taking 2 buses to get there and arriving just before 6. I smiled at strangers, poured coffee, and scrubbed booths, while thinking about my sons sitting cross-legged in a shed eating cereal and reading comics by flashlight. Then I'd clock out and rush to my second job at a grocery store, stocking shelves and unloading crates. In the evening, I sometimes returned to the diner for closing cleanup, whatever hours I could grab. Every night, no matter how tired I was, I came home. We sat on the floor and ate dinner together. Sometimes it was just cup noodles or canned beans and sandwich bread, but once in a while, if I found a deal, I'd bring home rotisserie chicken and frozen corn, and we'd call it a picnic. I'd light a tea candle and say we were camping under stars we couldn't see. After dinner, we'd do homework side by side. The boys read their stories aloud while I folded laundry or scrubbed the cooler. I checked their math sheets, corrected spelling, and clapped every time they got something right. I didn't care how tired I was. I needed them to know they mattered, that their minds and words and effort were more important than the space we lived in. I left handwritten notes in their lunch bags. You are brave. You are smart. You are loved. I used napkins when we ran out of paper and wrote in bright marker so they couldn't miss it. Some days that felt like the only color in their world. Bedtime was when I gave them dreams. I told stories about space pilots and twin explorers who built treehouse empires. In our stories, we weren't poor, we weren't stuck. We were smart and fearless and always together. I used to cry after they fell asleep, biting my lip so hard it left a mark. The shed was cold in the winter, hotter than a stove in the summer. Rain leaked through the roof. Sometimes I'd wake up to wet pillows or the sound of mice in the corner. But I kept going, every day, because I didn't know what else to do. It wasn't just about surviving. It was about creating rhythm and routine, even inside something that didn't feel like a home. Because as long as they felt safe, as long as they felt seen, then the walls didn't matter, the love did, and that was something no landlord could ever take away. It started with a quiet conversation outside the school cafeteria. Max's second-grade teacher asked if she could speak to me for a minute, and my first thought was that something was wrong. But she smiled gently and said Max had a way with numbers she hadn't seen in 20 years of teaching. I stood there holding a paper bag of apples from the discount bin, unsure what to say. She told me he was solving problems 3 grade levels ahead, making connections she hadn't even taught yet. I nodded, smiled politely, and thanked her, but I didn't believe her. To me, Max was just Max. He liked counting coins, building pyramids out of cereal boxes, and asking how elevators knew when to stop. He was curious, sure, but all kids were curious. At least that's what I told myself as I walked home and stared at the ceiling of the shed, wondering what I had missed. Then it happened again. A few weeks later, Theo's teacher called. She wanted to show me his reading assessment. He was reading at a 6th grade level, even though he was only in 2nd. That's when the school counselor got involved, then a psychologist. And before I knew it, there was a panel of people asking if I'd consider testing them both for a gifted program. They said it would be free, that they could get in on merit, but the program was clear across town, 17 miles away. I remember holding the acceptance letter in my hands. The paper shook, not from excitement but fear. I didn't have a car, I didn't know how we'd get there. And deep down, I didn't think I belonged in conversations like that. For weeks, I woke up at 3:45 a.m. and took the first bus out of the neighborhood. I changed twice, then walked the last mile through gravel roads and behind chain-link fences just to walk them through the school gates. I watched other parents kiss their kids goodbye and drive away in clean SUVs. I walked back to catch the bus to my first shift at the diner. I never let the boys see how scared I was. I told them it was temporary, that one day they'd be the ones designing those school buildings or running the science fairs. But some nights, when they were asleep, I sat with my knees pulled up under the thin blanket and wondered if I had done the right thing. Then the phone calls started. Their new teachers were amazed. They said Max finished math packets in half the time and helped other kids with patience well beyond his years. Theo stayed after class to recommend books to the librarian and started writing stories about robots and space missions. They weren't just keeping up, they were thriving. And for the first time in years, I saw them not just as survivors but as builders, as kids who could grow up to be the kind of men who change things, not just for themselves, but for people like us. Something shifted in me. I stopped worrying so much about how the world saw me and started focusing on what they were becoming. I told them they didn't need to be rich, they just needed to stay kind, stay curious, keep helping people. They nodded, like they understood. And maybe they did, because after that, their dreams weren't just about getting out of the shed. They started asking how we could help other families who lived like we did. And that's when I knew this story wasn't just mine anymore. It belonged to them too. To the future they were building, one question and one late-night homework session at a time. There were things I never told my sons, not because I wanted to lie to them, but because I needed them to feel safe. I needed them to believe the world was still kind, even when it wasn't. Most weeks I skipped meals so they could have seconds. I'd smile and say I wasn't hungry, even when my stomach growled loud enough to hear. On the hardest days, I'd donate plasma just to buy bus fare or groceries that wouldn't go bad in the heat. I lost a tooth one winter and didn't see a dentist for 2 years. I kept chewing on one side, and learned to smile with my mouth mostly closed. When the pain got too bad, I wrapped it in gauze and drank warm tea until it passed. I worked 14 days straight once and collapsed in the stockroom at the grocery store. I woke up with my back against a box of canned peaches, a coworker standing over me with wide eyes. I told her it was low blood sugar, but I knew better. There were mornings I stood in the corner of the shed to keep from waking the boys as I pulled on a clean shirt, even though I could barely stay upright. Nights when I wrapped my torso in a towel to soak up sweat from the fever I couldn't afford to treat. I took 2 Tylenol and prayed no one would notice. The fear was constant. If I cracked, if I showed too much, someone might step in and say I was unfit. I didn't know what the rules were, but I knew mothers lost their children for less. So I smiled through everything and made it look easy. Every ache, every skipped meal, every hour of sleep I gave up, I carried it in silence, because if I stayed invisible we could stay together. That was the only thing that mattered. I kept a notebook in my purse, the same one I started the day we moved into the shed. It was battered and stained, the corners curled and soft. Inside were dozens of lists. Goals like, buy a second blanket, get Max new shoes, save $50. Most of the pages were messy, some were smudged, but every checkmark felt like a mile. That notebook saved me. When I felt like we were stuck, I flipped through it and saw all the little wins. A working lamp, a clean uniform, a week with no skipped meals. No one else would have noticed, but to me, they were proof we were moving forward. I never asked for a miracle. I didn't wait for a handout or hope someone would rescue us. I just kept showing up, kept working, kept loving them in every quiet way I could. And they never saw the worst of it. They saw bedtime stories and birthday cupcakes made in a toaster oven. They saw effort, not exhaustion, joy, not fear. I protected that for them with everything I had. There's nothing glamorous about holding it all in. It hurts, it wears you down, but I never regretted a second of it. Because the truth is, the greatest sacrifices don't come with applause. They happen in silence, in private, where no one is watching. And sometimes, the people you're protecting never even know. But that was the point. I didn't need them to see how hard it was. I just needed them to keep believing we were going somewhere better. And as long as I kept going, they did too. There was a man who came into the diner every Tuesday morning. He always sat at the same booth near the window, ordered the same thing: black coffee, rye toast, scrambled eggs softened, left a tip folded neatly under his plate. He never talked much, just nodded, when I refilled his cup, and looked out at the street like he was waiting for something that never came. I didn't know his name for the first 6 months. I just called him the quiet man in the windbreaker. He wore the same faded jacket no matter the weather, and his hands trembled slightly when he stirred his coffee. Then one morning he lingered. I brought him the check, thanked him like I always did, and turned to walk away. But he spoke, low and steady, asking if my sons went to Lakeside Academy. I stopped short. My heart jumped into my throat. I asked why. He said he volunteered there, helped with the math enrichment program. Said he recognized Max's name on a test sheet and remembered Theo from a reading workshop. Then he looked up at me and said something I hadn't heard in a long time. "You've raised good boys." I didn't know how to respond. I mumbled something polite, smiled through the nerves, and walked back to the kitchen. My hands shook the rest of the shift. The next week, he returned with a folder. He didn't say much. Just handed it to me, told me to read it when I had a minute, and nodded like it wasn't a big deal. Inside was a letter from the school. Official letterhead, typed in clean lines. Both boys had been awarded full scholarships through middle and high school. Tuition, supplies, uniforms, transportation, everything. I read it 5 times before I let myself believe it was real. Then I stepped into the walk-in freezer, closed the door, and cried harder than I had in years. Not from sadness, not even from joy, from relief. Pure bone-deep, head-spinning relief. I tried to thank him the next time he came in, but he held up his hand, told me I didn't ask for help, told me that's what made it matter more. He said the school had a fund. He just made sure the right people saw my sons. That was it. A week later, a school van showed up outside the shed. The driver had a clipboard with their names and a box of supplies in the passenger seat. Inside were new backpacks, school lunches, gym shoes that actually fit, and 2 brand new laptops still wrapped in plastic. I sat on the edge of the mattress and stared at those boxes like they were made of gold. The boys screamed when they opened them. Theo hugged his computer like it might disappear. Max started crying because the keyboard lit up. Then came the woman from the nonprofit. She introduced herself at the diner, said she'd heard about us from the school. She had kind eyes and a folder of forms. She helped me apply for transitional housing, explained the program, subsidized rent for working parents, priority placement if you had school-aged children. 3 months later, we moved into a one-bedroom apartment. It wasn't fancy, but it had real walls, real plumbing, and enough outlets to run every lamp we owned. The boys shared a bed. I slept on a fold-out mattress in the corner. But we had a bathroom. We had a door I could lock. We had space to breathe. The first night, they ran down the hallway like it was a racetrack. I stood in the kitchen, staring at a crooked countertop, and felt something I hadn't felt in years. Stillness. Not fear. Not panic. Just the quiet sound of nothing going wrong. It didn't feel like a miracle. It felt like a door that had been closed for so long had finally cracked open, and all the light that poured through came from the quietest corner of my life. A man with a windbreaker. A woman with a folder. A moment where someone saw what I had been carrying and decided to help me set it down. Not loudly. Not publicly. Just enough to change everything. The apartment wasn't much by most standards. One bedroom, faded carpet, a kitchen counter that sloped just enough for marbles to roll off the edge. But to us, it felt like a palace. There were walls that didn't sweat when it rained, and a ceiling that didn't drip onto our pillows. There were light switches on every wall, not just one extension cord we had to rotate between the microwave and the lamp. The first night we stood in the middle of the room and just looked around, like we didn't quite believe we were allowed to be there. We didn't have a couch, or a dining table, or anything you might call furniture, but we had blankets and laughter, and the kind of peace that makes you breathe differently. For the first time in years, I closed a door behind me and felt safe. The boys made forts out of the moving boxes and raced through the hallway in their socks. Max claimed the windowsill for his books. Theo taped stars to the ceiling above his bed and called it the sky we never had in the shed. I slept on a fold-out mattress that made my back ache, but I didn't care. We had a toilet that flushed and a sink that didn't freeze over in the winter. We had a closet that held more than 2 jackets and a cabinet that wasn't made from milk crates. It sounds small now, but those things made us feel rich. Once we settled in, I signed up for a night class at the local community college. It was just one course intro to small business, but it felt like a declaration. Like I was finally saying out loud that my life could grow beyond just surviving. Around the same time, I started working part-time at a bakery across town. The owner, Cynthia, was in her 50s and wore her hair in a braid wrapped like a crown. She reminded me what kindness looked like when it wasn't suspicious or conditional. She taught me how to make cinnamon rolls from scratch and gave me permission to take home leftovers for the boys. When I told her I was taking a class, she offered to loan me her old business books. She said she saw something in me. I wasn't sure what, but I held on to that anyway. Bit by bit, I started experimenting in our tiny apartment kitchen. I borrowed pans from Cynthia and used the oven late at night when the boys were asleep. I tried new recipes, wrote down what worked, and took notes in the same notebook I had used since the shed. Eventually, I sold a dozen cookies at the Sunday market. Then a neighbor ordered a birthday cake. Word spread slowly, like sunlight through a cracked door, and I followed it. I didn't have a logo or a website or anything fancy. Just handwritten labels, brown paper boxes, and a folding table with a checkered cloth. I called it Rachel's Hearth. It felt simple and warm, the way I hoped people would feel when they ate something I made. We were still on a tight budget. I still worked long shifts and pinched every dollar. But now I was building something, not just for income, but for identity, for pride, for a future that belonged to me as much as it did to my sons. Every night, I went to sleep with the smell of flour on my hands and the sound of my boys breathing softly in their beds. And for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel like I was chasing something. I felt like I had arrived, not at the end of the road, but finally, at the beginning. Max was the first to leave. He got into a state university on a full scholarship and chose to study architecture. He said he wanted to design buildings that felt like safety, the kind you could live and breathe in. Theo followed 2 years later. He chose robotics, which made sense, considering he had taken apart every toaster we ever owned before he turned 10. He said machines made sense to him in a way the world often didn't. I watched them grow into themselves, not just as students, but as men. They stayed kind, thoughtful, curious. The kind of young men who opened doors for strangers and helped carry groceries for neighbors without being asked. When Max graduated, I sat in the front row wearing a blue dress I bought from a thrift store. It wasn't fancy, but but he told me I looked elegant. I cried through the whole ceremony, from the speeches to the walk across the stage to the moment he found me after, beaming and holding out his diploma like a trophy. 2 years later, I wore the same dress to Theo's graduation. This time, I brought tissues in my bag. It didn't help. I cried harder. He found me afterward, pulled me into a hug, and whispered that he couldn't have done it without me. I had never asked them for anything. I didn't want them to feel they owed me a thing. I wanted them to live freely, without guilt or burden. So when the envelope came in the mail, I wasn't expecting anything. It was a Thursday afternoon. I had just come home from the market, arms full of flour and eggs. There was a plain envelope on the table with my name written in Theo's handwriting. Inside was a folded piece of paper and a small silver key taped to the top. The note was short. "Mom," it said, "you spent your life giving us everything. It's our turn now." The paper beneath it was a deed, a cottage, 1 story, just outside of town, paid in full. I dropped to the floor before I even finished reading. I couldn't speak. I couldn't move. I sat there for a long time with my hands over my mouth, the key digging into my palm, not out of shock, out of release. Every skipped meal, every bus ride before sunrise, every night crying quietly in the dark so they wouldn't hear. All of it poured out of me in that moment like breath I had been holding for years. I moved into the cottage 3 months later. It had a little garden in the back and a porch that creaked just enough to feel like home. Max planted rosemary by the door. Theo built shelves for my cookbooks. They came over every Sunday with groceries and stories and new things they were working on. Sometimes I'd sit in the kitchen, sunlight pouring through the window, and just listen to them talk. About work, about their plans, about nothing. And I'd smile, because I knew they were good men. Not just successful. Not just smart. But good. They gave me a house. But more than that, they gave me peace. They gave me proof that everything I had poured into them had taken root. And now it was blooming, not loudly, not perfectly, but with love. Always with love. People often think revenge means shouting back, proving everyone wrong, or walking away with your head high and a speech ready. But for me, the quietest kind of revenge was simply choosing not to break. It was staying kind in a world that didn't always make space for softness. I didn't get even. I didn't fight to be seen. I just kept going, and somewhere along the way, that became enough. Now, I teach baking classes at the community center. Some days it's just cookies. Other days, it's women who've lost jobs, left bad relationships, or started over at 50, trying to believe they still matter. I volunteer when I can, and speak at small events for women who are rebuilding. I tell them the same thing I remind myself. You don't need to be loud to be powerful. You don't need to win in a way that makes headlines. Sometimes just choosing to keep loving, to keep building, is its own kind of victory. I walk through my little garden most mornings with coffee in hand and my shoes off. The rosemary bush has grown taller than I expected. When I see it, I think about the shed. I think about those nights wrapped in silence and fear. And then I think about now, about this peace, about my sons, about how far love can carry us when we let it. I didn't win by taking anyone down. I won by standing up every single day, even when I had nothing left. I won by becoming the kind of woman my boys could count on. And now, I live in the kind of home I used to dream about, where there is warmth, light, and laughter I didn't have to borrow. If you're watching this and you're in a hard place, if you're tired, invisible, or wondering if any of it is worth it, let me say this. Your story matters. Your love matters. Even if the world doesn't see it yet, it's shaping something powerful. Thank you for being here. If this story meant something to you, please share it with someone who needs to hear they're not alone. Leave a comment if you've been through something similar. And subscribe for more stories of strength, healing, and quiet victories that deserve to be told.